I sold my house to save my daughter's life. 7 days later, she handed me a garbage bag and told me to leave. But the moment I stepped outside, my phone rang, and what the lawyer said next changed everything. I remember standing in the kitchen that morning, holding my coffee mug with both hands the way I always do in October, when the cold starts creeping through the windows no matter how high you set the thermostat. The maple out front had gone completely red overnight. I used to love that tree. My late wife Helen planted it the year our daughter was born. 34 years ago. I remember thinking it looked like it was on fire. I didn't know yet that everything else was about to burn too. My name is Gerald. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the city of Edmonton, helped design drainage systems that most people never think about but everyone depends on. I retired at 62, modestly comfortable, with a house I owned outright on a quiet street in Street. Albert, 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard with a cedar deck I built myself over 2 summers. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. It was the house where my daughter took her first steps, where we sat around the table every Sunday, where Helen spent her last months. My daughter's name is Nicole. She's 34 now. When she was small, she used to climb into bed between Helen and me during thunderstorms and hold my hand so tight my fingers went white. I would have done anything for that little girl. I still would have. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. You don't stop feeling that way just because they grow up. You don't stop feeling that way even when they give you every reason to. Nicole had been living in Vancouver for 6 years, working in marketing at a tech company that always sounded more successful than it apparently was. She called me maybe once a month, sometimes less. I told myself that was just how it was with adult children these days, that she was busy, that the time difference made it awkward. I told myself a lot of things. Then in February, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual, and her voice was different, thin. She said she needed to talk to me about something serious. She said she'd been diagnosed with a kidney condition, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, she said, and she'd clearly practiced saying it and that it had progressed faster than her doctors expected. She was on dialysis 3 times a week. She needed a transplant. She'd been on the wait list for 14 months with no match. And then she said the words that turned my whole chest inside out. She said the specialist told her that a living donor from a direct family member gave significantly better long-term outcomes. She said she'd been too scared to ask me. She said she didn't want me to feel obligated. I told her to stop talking. I told her I was coming to Vancouver. I flew out the following weekend. I sat across from her in her apartment, a nice apartment. I noticed, nicer than I expected, granite countertops, a view of the water, and I looked at my daughter, who looked pale and tired and smaller than I remembered, and I said, "Have them test me." She cried. I held her the way I used to when she was small and scared of thunder. The testing took 6 weeks. I drove to the University of Alberta Hospital in Edmonton for the blood work, the imaging, the consultations with the transplant team. My GP, Dr. Okafor, went through everything with me carefully. He told me at 67 I was in good health for my age, that my remaining kidney function would be sufficient, that the surgery carried real risks but was manageable. He asked me multiple times if I understood what I was agreeing to. I told him I understood. I told him I was certain. What I was less certain about, what I told no one at the time, was the money. Nicole's treatment had drained her savings. The dialysis, the medications not fully covered under her employer's benefits, the specialist visits. She owed $23,000 on a line of credit and was behind on rent. She hadn't told me the full picture until I sat down with her properly that second visit, when I asked her directly to show me the numbers. She was ashamed. I could see it. She kept apologizing, kept saying she didn't want to burden me, and I kept telling her to stop. I had my pension, which was adequate for my own expenses. But I also had the house. I'd had it assessed 2 years earlier at $680,000. In the current Edmonton market, it would likely go higher. The thought had occurred to me before Nicole even asked. She didn't ask. That matters. She never directly asked me to sell the house. But I made the decision. I called my real estate agent, a man named Doug, who'd sold us the house originally back in 1998 and had stayed a family friend. I told him I wanted to list it. He asked if I was sure. I told him I was sure. The house sold in 11 days for $694,000. After fees and the remaining property tax adjustment, I netted just over $651,000. I paid off Nicole's $23,000 line of credit. I gave her $40,000 as a cushion, what I called a fresh start fund. The rest I put into a GIC and a TFSA, keeping it accessible but structured, so I'd have income. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Street Albert, month to month, at $1,450. I thought it was temporary. I thought once things settled, once Nicole was better, we'd figure out the next chapter together. Maybe I'd move to Vancouver. Maybe she'd come back east. I hadn't thought it through completely. I was thinking about my daughter's life, not about real estate portfolios. I moved out of the house on a Thursday in late April. I stood in the empty living room for a few minutes before I locked the door for the last time. The walls had these pale rectangles where our photos had hung for decades. Helen's watercolor of Jasper was the last thing I'd taken down. I stood there and I thought, this is what love looks like. Not the feeling, the action. This is what you actually do when you love someone. The surgery was scheduled for the 3rd week of May. Nicole flew to Edmonton 2 days before. She stayed in my apartment. I slept on the couch and gave her the bed without discussion. We watched television in the evenings. We ordered Thai food. She seemed lighter than she had in months. She thanked me so many times I had to tell her to stop, that she was embarrassing both of us. We laughed about that. I keep coming back to that. We laughed about that. The morning of the surgery, we were prepped in adjacent rooms. I could hear her voice through the curtain at one point talking to a nurse, and I remember thinking, she sounds like Helen, that same cadence. I hadn't noticed it in years. They gave me the sedative and I counted backward and then there was nothing. I woke up in recovery with a heaviness in my left side that felt like someone had filled me with wet concrete. The nurse, a young man named Trevor with a gentle manner, told me everything had gone well. He told me Nicole was in recovery too and that the transplant team was pleased. He asked me my pain level, and I said 4, and he adjusted something in my IV, and the edges of everything went soft. I slept for a long time. The next 2 days were slow and uncomfortable, in the way hospital days are: the beeping, the vitals checks every few hours, the food that arrives at times that make no sense, the effort it takes to get to the bathroom. Trevor was on shift both days, and he checked on me more than was probably required. We talked a little. He had a daughter about Nicole's age. He asked about her. On the second evening, a woman appeared in my doorway. She was around 50, well-dressed, dark coat. She introduced herself as Nicole's colleague, a woman named Patricia, who Nicole had asked to bring some things from the apartment. She set a bag down beside the bed. She looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to read at the time. She said Nicole was recovering well and had asked her to pass along that she'd come see me tomorrow. I said that was fine. I thanked her. Patricia paused at the door. She looked like she wanted to say something else. She didn't. She left. Nicole came the following afternoon, day 3 post-surgery. She was moving carefully, slowly, the way you move when your body has been through something enormous. But she was upright and her color was better, and when she walked into my room I felt a relief, so complete it was almost physical. I reached for her hand. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. She didn't take my hand. She set a folder on my tray table. She said, "Dad, I need you to look at these." I assumed it was medical paperwork, something about follow-up care, medications, discharge planning. I reached for the folder. Inside were legal documents. The top page had the logo of a law firm I didn't recognize, a Vancouver firm. The language was dense, but the structure was clear enough. It was a formal declaration stating that I was transferring the proceeds of the home sale, the full $651,000, minus what had already been dispersed into a trust account in Nicole's name. In exchange, Nicole would cover my living expenses at a care facility. There was a second document, a consent form for a long-term care placement at a facility in Sherwood Park. I read it twice. Then I looked up at my daughter. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the window. I said, "Nicole, what is this?" She said she'd been thinking about it for a while. She said she was sorry. She said that with her medical costs and the fact that she'd be unable to work full-time for months, she needed financial security. She said the care facility was very good, that she'd researched it, that I'd be comfortable there. She said it made sense, given my age, to have support around me. She said it like she'd rehearsed it. She said it like she was reading from something she'd memorized. I said, "You want me to sign over the money from my house?" She said, "It would be in your name too, on the trust." I said, "Nicole, I just gave you a kidney." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I know, Dad. I know you did." There was a sound in the hallway. Trevor was walking past, and he glanced in, and I must have looked the way I felt because he paused. Nicole noticed and straightened in her chair. She said she wasn't trying to hurt me. She said she just needed security. She said she'd still be part of my life, that this didn't change anything. I thought of the kitchen on October mornings. I thought of the pale rectangles on the wall where our photos used to hang. I thought of Helen's watercolor. I told Nicole I needed time to read everything. She said the lawyer was waiting for a call. She said she just needed me to sign so she could move forward with her recovery without the financial stress. I said, "Give me until tomorrow." Her face changed. Just briefly. Something tightened in it. She said, "Okay." She stood up carefully and she kissed the top of my head the way she used to when she was a teenager and I was sitting at my desk and she wanted something. I had always found that charming. Sitting there in that hospital bed with the wet concrete feeling in my left side, I thought, I have been very naive for a very long time. She left the folder. I lay there for a long time after she left. Trevor came in to check my vitals around 5 o'clock and he asked how I was doing and I told him I'd had some difficult news. He didn't pry. He adjusted my pillow. He said, "You want me to see if the social worker is available? We have a patient advocate on the floor." I said no. Then I said, "Actually, yes. If it's not too much trouble." Her name was Donna. She was in her 40s, efficient. With reading glasses she pushed up on her head while she taught. She came in around 6 after dinner, and she closed the door and she sat down and she said, "Trevor mentioned you might want to talk through some things. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to be clear that I'm not a lawyer, but I am going to say some things I think you need to hear." She said any document signed during a period of medical vulnerability, particularly in a hospital setting, under time pressure, without independent legal counsel, is highly susceptible to challenge. She said the language I'd described, specifically the transfer of assets in exchange for care placement, had characteristics of what elder law specialists called undue influence. She said there was a legal aid clinic she could connect me to. She said if I wanted, she could make a call tonight. I said yes. The next morning, before Nicole was due to come back, a man named Arthur called my cell. He was a lawyer with Edmonton Community Legal Center, referred through the hospital's patient advocacy program. He spoke quietly and methodically. He asked me to describe the documents. He asked about the timeline, the home sale, the financial gifts, the surgery, the folder appearing on day 3. He asked if I had signed anything. I said I had not signed anything. He said, "Good. Don't sign anything until we've spoken in person." Arthur came to the hospital that afternoon. He was older than I expected, maybe mid-60s, with a navy cardigan and the careful manner of someone who has heard many versions of many bad situations. He reviewed the documents for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up and he said, "Mr. Gerald, what your daughter has presented you with is not an informal family arrangement. This is a structured asset transfer, prepared by a licensed solicitor, under circumstances that a court would almost certainly view as exploitative." He said there was a specific provision under Alberta's Adult Guardianship and Trusteeship Act, as well as relevant common law precedent, that addressed exactly this kind of situation, agreements made with a vulnerable adult in a dependency position. He said the transfer could be blocked. He said the assets I'd already disbursed, the $23,000 debt payment, the $40,000 gift were more complicated, but were also potentially subject to recovery given the circumstances. He said, "Did anyone advise you to get independent legal counsel before you sold your home and gave your daughter the money?" I said no. He said, "Did your daughter's lawyer contact you at any point before these documents appeared?" I said no. He wrote something in his notebook. He said he would be filing an urgent application and that I should avoid contact with Nicole until he advised otherwise. He said I should also let the hospital know not to share any information about my care or discharge with her. I asked him, "Is this criminal?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The civil case is very strong. The criminal question, whether this rises to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under the criminal code, is one for the RCMP. But I would say the facts, as you've described them, warrant a report." Nicole came back that afternoon. Trevor met her in the hallway before she reached my room and told her I was resting and had asked not to have visitors. I don't know exactly what Nicole said to that. Trevor came and told me she'd left. He didn't editorialize. He just said she'd left. That night I called my brother Frank in Saskatoon. Frank is 71 and retired from the military and has never been a man of many words, but he drove to Edmonton the next morning without being asked. He walked into my hospital room at 11 a.m. and he sat down and he said, "What do you need?" That was it. Just, "What do you need?" I said, "Right now I just need someone in the room." He stayed for 4 days. I was discharged on day 6. Arthur had already begun the legal process. He filed an application in Court of King's Bench of Alberta to freeze the remaining funds, the GIC and TFSA, pending an investigation into undue influence. The court granted an interim order within 48 hours. The money didn't move. What happened over the next 3 months I can only describe as exhausting in a way that is different from other kinds of exhaustion. There were statements to give, documents to produce, a meeting with an RCMP financial crimes officer named Sergeant Beaumont, who asked careful, precise questions for 2 hours. Arthur had told me to expect the legal process to take time. It did. But it also moved with a steadiness I hadn't expected. The evidence apparently was not subtle. Nicole's Vancouver lawyer, the one who had drafted the documents, was ultimately found to have been retained by Nicole 6 weeks before my surgery. 6 weeks. While I was going through testing and consultations and signing consent forms, while I was arranging the sale of my house, she had retained a lawyer to draft asset transfer documents 6 weeks before she ever came to Edmonton. Sergeant Beaumont told me this in a phone call in August. He said it in the same careful, precise tone he used for everything. I sat in my small apartment in Street, Albert with the phone against my ear, and I looked out at the parking lot and I thought about the October morning and the maple tree that had gone completely red overnight. The civil case concluded the following February. The court found that the documents Nicole had presented constituted an attempt to obtain financial benefit through undue influence over a vulnerable adult. The GIC and TFSA, approximately $568,000 after the disbursements to Nicole, were confirmed fully in my name. Arthur also successfully argued for partial recovery of the $40,000 gift on the basis of unjust enrichment, given the documented premeditation. Nicole was ordered to repay $31,000. The criminal matter took longer. The charge was criminal breach of trust and financial exploitation. Nicole pleaded guilty in March of the following year. She received a conditional sentence 12 months to be served in the community, with conditions and 3 years probation. I was told that the guilty plea, her medical circumstances at the time of the offense, and her lack of prior record were all factors. Arthur explained the sentencing framework to me carefully. He said the outcome reflected the realities of the system. I sat with that for a long time. I'm not going to tell you I've made peace with everything. I don't think you should feel obligated to make peace with things that don't deserve peace. But I'll tell you what I have found, which is something I didn't expect. Her name is Patricia, the woman who came to my hospital room on the second day. Nicole's colleague, who brought the bag from the apartment and stood in the doorway with an expression I didn't know how to read. She called me in September, about 4 months after the surgery. She said she'd heard what had happened through people who knew Nicole. She said she was sorry. She said she'd suspected something was wrong that day in the hospital, that Nicole had behaved strangely in the days before, that Patricia had told herself it wasn't her place. She said she'd thought about calling me since and hadn't known if she should. I told her I was glad she'd called. We met for coffee at a place in downtown Edmonton. She'd relocated from Vancouver, coincidentally, for a new job. We talked for 3 hours. She'd lost her father the previous year. She understood something about the particular grief of being failed by someone you'd spent your whole life protecting. We've had dinner a few times since. She brought a bottle of Okanagan Red. I made the chicken stew Helen used to make. We sat on either side of my small table in my small apartment, and we talked about her father and about Helen and about what it means to start over when you're past the age where starting over seems like it should still be possible. There's something I know now that I wish I'd known before, not just about Nicole, but about myself. I thought love meant removing every obstacle between the people I cared about and what they needed. I thought the measure of a father was how much he was willing to give. I didn't understand that giving without conditions isn't always generosity. Sometimes it's just the door you leave open. I'm not telling you this so you distrust your children. Most children are not Nicole. Most families are not this. I'm telling you this because I spent 67 years believing that the people who were supposed to love you back actually would, and I never once thought to protect myself. I never once thought that was something I was allowed to do. The maple tree at the old house, I drove past it last October. The new owners have kept it. It had gone completely red again, the way it does, the way it always has. I sat in the car for a minute looking at it. Helen planted that tree 34 years ago. It doesn't belong to me anymore, but I'm still here. And it turns out that's enough to start with. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever given everything for someone and found yourself standing in a parking lot wondering where it went, leave a comment. I read everyone. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. You might be the phone call that changes something for them.